Sherwin joins us live now. Sherwin, thank you so much for your time this evening. When is that address expected by U.S. President Joe Biden? Well, the president's late, Bongi. We were supposed to be speaking right now, but, you know, given the schedule of heads of state, they tend to run late from time to time. But we can certainly preface what we might hear from President Biden. You will understand that, you know, the United States is the closest ally of Israel, certainly in the context of a very diverse Middle East. It was the first country in the world to recognize Israel as a state in 1948. It is Israel's largest cumulative donor in terms of foreign direct assistance since World War II, with almost all bilateral aid in the form of military assistance. We are seeing numbers of around $158 billion in bilateral assistance and military aid to Israel. So that will give you the context. What you're going to hear from President Biden after his meeting with those other four Western countries is really to reiterate Washington's ironclad support of Israel here. It will express solidarity. They released a statement overnight saying that they want to make clear that terrorist actions of Hamas have no justification, no legitimacy, and must be universally condemned. Our countries will support Israel in its efforts to defend itself and its people against such atrocities. We must emphasize that this is not a moment for any party hostile to Israel to exploit these attacks and seek advantage. And I think you're going to hear a reference possibly to the UN Charter. Article 51 of the UN Charter says that nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member state of the United Nations, right? So how do you juxtapose Israel's right to defend itself with the rights of civilians that are now caught up in this conflict, in this military intervention that you're seeing playing itself out in Gaza? And there's a great deal of concern from quarters at the United Nations, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, that essentially coordinates humanitarian responses around the world. Great concern now in terms of the siege that is being imposed on Gaza. No fuel, no water, no food, no emergency medical supplies. Great concern for the 2 million plus people that are caught up in this very confined enclave with nothing going in and nothing going out except bombs right now from above. And Sherwin, you know, when you read and also listen to some of the experts who are talking about this latest one, they say that the U.S. is in a position to be able to try and end and facilitate an end to this particular conflict, that pressure must be put on both Hamas and Israel to be able to speak it out or also find a solution on both sides. I wonder, though, if this is something that we could be hearing from Joe Biden, or is it going to be from what, you know, more of what we've been hearing over the weekend, especially where he's been talking about, you know, intelligence gathering, the hostages, and just how they're going to try and also get involved? Well, from the U.S. perspective, from a Western perspective, I think you're going to see some deference to Israel's right to defend itself. Yeah, they will be granted, I imagine, a window here to respond to these attacks from Hamas, right? The targeting of civilians. We're getting crazy reports about children being targeted, elderly being targeted. So there's a great deal of emotion right now in terms of the situation on the ground. And so Israel's right to defend itself will be front and center in terms of what President Biden will say. The question is, does President Biden then go long-term here, right? The long-term issue, as the U.S. being the lead mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is decades long, do they then talk about an off-ramp? Do they then talk about the need for direct negotiations, right? These are references we've heard over the years before, but certainly over the last 5 years, we have not seen those direct negotiations that can lead to this a two-state solution that is the international policy here in terms of the creation of two independent states living side by side in peace and tranquility. We haven't seen that for over 75 years. Will the president talk about that long term? Is he going to talk about the need to re-engage with groups like the Quartet? What is the role of the UN Security Council here? So in terms of long term, there are long-standing issues that have not been addressed, certainly from the Palestinian authority side, from the Israeli side, and in between that you have these militant factions like Hamas that are taking things into their own hands and creating even greater disruption, despite feeling justified, if you will, given the long-standing issues facing Palestinians in terms of their fight for self-determination and independence. So these are very complicated issues. The United States is not always seen as an independent mediator in these conflicts. It has used its veto often to protect Israel in the UN Security Council. So, we'll certainly wait and see what the president has to say.
And Sherwin, you talk about the emotion of it all, and we've seen, some of the visuals even on social media of what is taking place, and also listening to some of our correspondents who are talking about the hostage situation. Let's talk about, some of the Americans, because some of the reports suggesting that there are Americans, unfortunately, who have been killed in this particular conflict, but at the same time, it's still unclear whether or not some of them have been held hostage. What do we know?
Yeah, what happens in Israel is very personal to the United States, right? They have this very close relationship with what happens in Israel. It becomes a huge political issue in the United States Congress, what happens to Israel. In fact, President Biden is being criticized here for making concessions to Iran, and the Republicans are accusing him of, deferring to Iran that has allowed, the spillover in terms of the violence we're seeing on the ground right now. So this is a very political hot potato in the United States, and it's worth understanding that. New York, for example, has the largest Jewish population living outside of Israel. So it's a huge political issue in terms of elections in the United States, and so there is a lobby in the United States that is very, very strong in terms of what happens in Israel. The big concern now is how long do we see these airstrikes continue, right? We understand that Israel is reasserting its authority in terms of what Hamas was able to do in its territory. We are seeing it reasserting its authority in terms of the border between southern Israel and Gaza. The question is, how long is Israel going to be allowed to defend itself, to respond here in terms of what the UN Charter, Article 51, allows, and what is going to be said about the people and the suffering that will now perpetuate itself in Gaza? Those airstrikes that you are seeing from the sky are destroying infrastructure. You have no water going in. You have no food going in. You have over 200,000 people displaced. They have nowhere to go in this very, very tightly enclosed space, near the southern border with Israel. The question is, how long will they be able to exist under siege without supplies going in? These are questions for the international community. And so while we might hear from President Biden today, you might be hearing other voices come to the fore as this process begins to play itself out.
And such a voice we even heard last night, the UN Secretary General expressing serious concern over that, and saying that a humanitarian crisis must be averted at all costs, especially if now there's talk of supplies being cut. Sherwin, let's then watch and see when the president begins to speak, and we will take you live there as the viewers to that particular address as soon as it gets underway, and also have Sherwin back there as we continue to monitor this particular story. That is our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Peace.